folks, this is Eddie Carson, and you are listening to the show Race Matters. You're listening to this at WJOP LP, Newburyport, Joppa Radio 96.3. I'm excited to have folks chime in and listen to the conversation of the show that I have for you tonight. You know, one of the topics that I want to delve into just for a little bit, and this is a topic that a lot of folks don't think about a lot, and that is, what does it mean to be an African American, or better yet, what does it mean to be a black non-believer? What does it mean to be a black atheist? What does it mean to be black and a person who's black who doesn't subscribe to any semblance of religiosity when it comes to particularly things such as being Muslim or being Christian? And it oftentimes, particularly here in the United States, that's almost hearsay, to say the least. You know, as we delve into the show tonight, I'll share a little bit about my background, particularly when it comes to this notion of black religiosity and being black here in the United States. For me, you know, growing up in my household, I wouldn't say that we were particularly super religious growing up. This was one of those things where, you know, over time there are aspects of religion, but yet, even as a kid, I remember my parents always talking about things such as, you know, it's important to be baptized. It's important to have some semblance of a belief. But this is something that wasn't part of our standard table conversation. We didn't roll up. We didn't get ready every single Sunday, put on a suit and a tie to head over to church and to really participate in the performance of worship. That wasn't really part of our narrative. I will say this about my parents. They didn't discourage that. In many ways, too, my brother and I had ample opportunities to participate into this. And we did. That's something that we did do. This idea of not believing in God or there's no God, that just made no sense, particularly for the fact that I was born and raised in the deep South in Montgomery, Alabama. And the reality, of course, of growing up there, religion is part of the everyday fabric in terms of who you are, especially as a black believer. You know, it was interesting because by the time I got to high school, I wouldn't say that I was questioning my understanding and my sense and my belief in God and religion. It wasn't really there yet. And I'll kind of come to that conclusion a little bit later. I was essentially really following the narrative that was there. But I will say some things that bothered me at times. And this is about individuals. This has nothing to do with black people, whether they're Christian or Muslim or something else. In terms of being atheist and agnostic or anything of that particular merit, to say the least. This is really about my observation of religion, particularly my observation when it came to notions of Christianity. I can't speak for Islam. I can't speak much for Judaism, but I can speak toward the notion of Christianity. I remember I had a friend, and one of the things that we would do is I would go to church with her on Sundays. We went to Hutchinson Missionary Baptist Church. This is a black church in Montgomery, Alabama, and the folks were great. I remember participating in sleepovers, and at this point I'm in high school, just to be clear. I remember participating in sleepovers, going to worship services on Sundays, participating in Bible classes, and really wrestling with this notion of religion. My friend, and I won't share her name because I didn't ask for her permission to do that. But my friend would invite me, and we would always go. And I usually participated with her and her dad, a wonderful human being, and that brother recently passed away. And so I just want to give a shout out to him, who was in my thoughts, on my mind, as someone who I was afraid of, just to be honest with you, but who was just super awesome and really an outstanding individual. But we would participate in church, you know, and my friend, she and I would do this, and we would join her brother, her sister, and her dad, and we would do this on Sundays. And I remember going and feeling at times out of place, really wrestling with this idea of, do I really believe in this? Why am I attending church? Am I attending church because my high school girlfriend wanted me to go? wanted me to participate in this, and it was important. It was super important to her. So in many ways, it was important to me, and I did that. I did that for a period of time, and the things, of course, I recall from that experience has nothing to do with notions of God or notions of believing or anything like this. This is more of a ethnographic observation that I made during that time period. And that observation, of course, in many ways and at times was somewhat judgmental too. Didn't own suits. I don't even know if I even owned a lot of ties. I think I probably stole my dad's tie, or borrowed, I should say, his ties when I was participating in this. And we would participate, and I remember just being in church, and at times I would turn to her and say, "Oh, we should skip. We should just get out of this. There's a candy store up the road. We can go hang out there." And of course, she would push back quite a bit. And I have a lot of great fun memories of being at Hutchinson Missionary Baptist Church, spending my time there, because that was really part of my upbringing. And although it was part of my upbringing, it was also one of those things where I wasn't sure that my faith was in the same position that a lot of other folks' faith was at. And particularly, it definitely wasn't where my friend's faith was at. She was a strong believer at that time. I don't know where she's at when it comes to religion today. We don't have those kind of conversations or anything like that today. But it was something I observed. And so going back to this idea of going there and I remember just this feeling of not having a suit, not having that Sunday morning, that Sunday suit, not having that tie. Trying to feel like I'm having to dress up for something, being frustrated by that. And again, this is not about the people. All of this is about me and my sense of trying to make sense of this world. The interesting thing, of course, about this is that while I'm going to church with her, I'm attending a religious private school. And this religious private school is really sanctioned within a body known as the Churches of Christ. And their sense of religion was quite different too. And I kind of created this dichotomy at a young age, right? When I would go to church with my friend, that was the black church. And I went and I hung out with black folks. I listened to black folks who worshiped, who praised, who brought their sense of spirituality, their sense of joy, all their emotional pain, all of their hope, their salvation, all the things that made them feel strong. This was their sense of community. And while I really didn't feel like I was a part of that community, it was something that I observed. On the other hand, when I think back to this idea that I was attending this white private school which with a religious orientation, there were times I went to church with white folks. And I came away with some really interesting contrasting elements at a young age. Remember, at this point, I'm not thinking about this as an academic. And for those of you who've never chimed in nor listened to this show before, one of the things that I focus on a great deal is 20th century American race and religion. And I can extend that even to the 21st century as I continue to do that quite a bit. So I'm attending both of these churches and I'm making sense of it. And I'm wrestling with this idea. And that idea is, do I believe? Am I a believer? Am I listening to people who are convincing me to believe in something that I'm not quite sure about? Because if there's anyone on record who is very weak when it comes to having a faith in God, I'm going to raise my hand. That person is me. And I've been that way my entire life. And I'll add and say a little bit more about that later as we continue to expand this, particularly in a macro sense when we think about religiosity. But, to most people in the world, to the vast majority of people in the world, faith and religion is really important. Having that sense of comfort, having that desire to want to know, where do we come from and where are we going? For many folks, their sense of faith gives them an objective. And that objective, of course, is to live a particular life in order to please and to serve their God. This doesn't mean people who don't believe are awful, bad, terrible people. Because, I'm someone today in the 21st century, I would subscribe and define myself as being a bit of a humanist. And being a bit of a humanist, I really look at the world of religion quite differently. There are people who've shaped me, though, when it comes to religion. And those folks are really important. I have to start with my wife, who grew up in a church, whose father was a minister. This notion of religion is really important to her and important to them. My wife and I, we have different views on religion these days. And my view on religion has been evolving, not really going through a devolution process, but evolving in terms of my understanding of where I am and where do I position myself when it comes to faith. So that's my wife, who's an important part of this. My high school teachers, my high school football coach, all of those people were super important in my understanding, in my growth in faith and understanding who I am at that particular time. But yet, even during that journey, I was still wrestling with this notion of, do I believe? Does this information, does this content make sense? I was never an emotional person, and I am an emotional person, let me say that. But when it came to faith and religion, I wasn't a deeply emotional person. The way some folks, the way they feel their belief in God and their sense of religion and spirituality feels very different from the way I internalize that process. And yet, when we think about this notion of being Black and an American, religion has become the backbone, the root, the fabric, the foundation of what does it mean to be a Black believer, a Black Christian. I want to share this with you, and this is information from the Pew Research Center. One of the things that they noted, of course, is the fact that Black Americans who do not identify with any religion is increasing here in the 21st century. And there's no surprise, and I have a lot of thoughts on that I'll get to in a little bit. It's true among Americans overall in general that what we're seeing as we've continued to move forward and progress and think about elements of science, think about rationalism, thinking about materialism. And I'm not saying that all of these things are super positive or good things. I'm just stating what is. And that is this fact that people's sense of religiosity, their sense of faith and belief has declined. And this is all populations. But this is particularly growing among Black people. See, to be Black and to be a non-believer, particularly in a Black community, is seen as a cardinal sin, heresy. There are a lot of things that you can be and you can do, but to not believe in God is not one of those things. I mean, shoot, there are gangsters out there. There are folks who are living a life that would not be one of a WWJD, or what would Jesus believe, or what would Jesus do in this particular sense. This wouldn't be one of those aspects that's there. But yet, those folks still, regardless of the life they're living and their style and their fashion and whatever you want to call it, they still believe in God. It's kind of like watching a mob movie. You think about the Italian mob, for example, or if we're going to think about Boston here, you think about the mob. They can commit crimes, they can shoot people, they can do all of this stuff, and yet they're going to be in church. They're going to be in mass come Sunday, because that is just who they are. Because religion in many ways becomes a cultural phenomenon when we subscribe this to racial and geographical identity and ethnic identity too. It's important to keep in mind too, and its Pew Research noted that the vast majority of Black folks are believers. Religiously unaffiliated Black folks, for example, Black Americans, they do believe in God. And about half of them claim or state that they pray regularly. Although, and they'll be the first to say, that while they believe in God and while they pray frequently, many of them don't attend any type of particular religious service. They are just Christian. And that's an interesting and a confusing thing too, because, what does it mean to be Christian and yet you don't practice the tenets of being Christian? I struggle with that. And again, that's the individual thing. This isn't so much about God per se and how I feel and my disbelief in God and how that's continued to grow over a period of time too. You know, the widespread belief in God among black, particularly those we'll call the non-believers, is oftentimes driven primarily by those who say their religion is nothing in particular, rather than those who identify as, say, an atheist or an agnostic. You can ground it up in that sense. Among those who say they're religious, but yet nothing particular, 94% believe in God or some sort or some sense of a higher power. And so I used the word spiritual earlier, and I think I kind of misused that word because you can be spiritual and not believe in God. So I conflated it just a little bit. Among Americans overall, about 7 in 10, right? So we're talking about regardless of socioeconomic status, regardless of one's racial or ethnic background, Americans overall, 7 in 10 non-believers in this sense believe in some type of higher power, which is an interesting stat. About half of unaffiliated black Americans pray at least monthly. And so there are those who claim that they don't have this sense of belief, but they still pray because there's got to be something out there. You know, I'm sure we've all heard the notion that I've never met an agnostic or an atheist when I am in a plane that's 30,000 feet in the air and that plane is going down. Everyone has a belief at that particular point too, right? Because that's when we start to lose sight of faith in humans, this notion of humanism and science, when an aircraft is going down, created by those things, and a growing sense and faith and understanding God continues to grow. About 8 in 10 black folks, they seldom or never attend a religious service. And these are folks who really don't have any committed categorical direction when it comes to religion. When it comes to prayer, there's a lot of variation that's here too, all right? And so just a couple other statistics, and I don't want to inundate our show by talking about a lot of numbers and all of that stuff, but I think there's some tangible stuff that we do need to talk about here. You know, the share of black nuns who say they rarely or never pray, which is about 45%, is nearly identical to the share who pray multiple times a week, which is roughly around 43%, again, citing the Pew Research. However, regular prayer is much more common among those who say their religion is nothing in particular. I think that's an interesting statistic than, say, among those who identify as being an atheist or an agnostic. Among religiously affiliated black people, 91% say they pray multiple times a week. That's a high number. And so while we're starting to see across all races this decline in a sense of religiosity, and we're also seeing this be a particular true element too among black folks, we're still seeing a large number of people who are buying into that, who have some sense of religion, some sense of faith. You know, I think it's interesting because I wanted to share this anecdote with you, as one woman suggested in a study that I got from another source, that many black people do go to church because it is the only spiritual path they are familiar with. You think about that, right? The idea, of course, among black Americans, they've grown up in a black church. The black church has been the salvation from suffering that has been brought about at the hands of white supremacy. And so in order to combat this notion of white supremacy, black folks have subscribed and they've bought into the idea that God is going to save us, right? Much like we saw Moses and what that brother did in terms of, right, escaping Pharaoh on one side of the river. Black folks are escaping that side of the river for a long period of time, and we call that the American South, when escaping slavery and migrating to the North. You know, a quote by this one black sister, she stated, "I just think that we don't know another way of doing it." And she's talking about black people. There's nothing else. What else is there if there's no sense of black religion, black understanding of God, a black belief system, because there's other forms of guidance and comfort and inspiration and things like that. There's another form of being close to God, which is kind of like meditation. But black people, we don't always have to run to a place because, as she noted, we always believe that you're at a temple and your body is part of that temple that's connected to some semblance of faith. You know, when reflecting on a personal struggle, oftentimes, and again, this is true for black people, one person stated, if I'm going to go through something, the only way I'm going to go through it is by talking to myself, sitting by myself, thinking with myself. What do I want? Where do I want to be? What am I doing that's wrong? What am I doing that's right? At the end of the day, it's this sense of one's feelings. So you have to get to the root of one's own sense of problems in a world that really subscribes to this idea of having a faith, a belief that's there. You know, as we continue to think about this notion of religiosity, and something that I struggled with my entire life. And I think that's one of the reasons why I really delved into understanding my studies in biblical Christianity and really trying to connect the relationship between black folks, all folks, and racism, and those connections to the spiritual religious formation that we oftentimes see. It's clear that black folks have faced a lot of trepidation. First, we had slavery. All right, we had to deal with slavery. We were brought to this country enslaved. We weren't born enslaved. We were brought to this country as enslaved human beings and converted to Christianity. We're converted to Christianity by people who consider and define themselves as Christians because human beings were created in the likeness of God. And yet, this mistrust during slavery and Jim Crow is giving us the semblance of, so is this the comfort that God created? Black people oftentimes didn't fully delve into this because they've become convinced for a long period of time that there is a God, and that God is that of the Christian God. And if that God is that of the Christian God, then we have a belief, regardless of what we're hearing about there being God, compassion, and understanding of the human welfare and well-being, right? So we go from slavery to Jim Crow. You know, black people nestled in the black church as a haven for so long as we battled both of those contentions. You know, you think back in the 1950s and the 1960s, black folks congregated to fight legal oppression. We organized in a way in which we could challenge Jim Crow. See, the church, much like you could say the barbershop in some ways, was really situated and designed in order for us to come together to strategize, to organize, to protest, to push back against the dominant cultural narrative of a white supremacist country called the United States. You know, a wonderful book that I want to point out to you is this book called The Color of Christ. And two American religious historians that I'm a huge fan of. One person by the name of Edward Bloom, whom I work closely with. I think I've been on a couple panels with him. I think we may have even written some stuff together in the past. And his colleague, Paul Harvey, they argued in this book that black folks and whites were once unified under the mantle of Christianity in an effort to combat societal vice and ills. That's what they're going to say, right? We go back to the civil rights struggles. We understand that the civil rights struggles in the 1960s was an interracial movement among black and white Christians. Yet, in more recent decades, we know that black religiosity has shifted away from the old-time notion of the civil rights period and that of the black church to this growing rationalism and understanding of what is religion to the black man here in the 21st century. You know, Though many within the black community continue to showcase their religious conservatism, and folks, black people can be quite conservative. We're going to have a future episode where I'm going to really be very hard on black conservatism, particularly in terms of how they've used religion to condemn our queer brothers, sisters, and non-binary folks. Others have slowly drifted away. All right, you have the black conservatives here who are doing these things, but you have other folks who are looking at this, and they're growing up in an age of a different type of activism. Not the activism that really pushed and challenged these elements of white supremacy back in the 1950s and the 1960s, but we're seeing a growing youthful change of folks, of black folks, who are not going to church to fight justice, or really to compete and push back against injustice. But they're going to find themselves really organizing in different struggle movements, whether it's Black Lives Matter, and we can go on and on and on. And not just from the black church, right? When we think about how black people have shifted away, but black folks have shifted away from religion in general, right? They're not just abandoning the black church, but they're leaving religion in general. And there are a couple reasons for that. And I think it would be an injustice for me not to point out some of the reasons that I've come to conclude while we're seeing black folks move away from religion. You know, I think a lot of it has to do with black educational attainment. Right? We've continued to, with desegregation down, with greater opportunities to enhance and become educated, to become more aware and more cognizant of a broader world. That world starts to get smaller as we start to make deductions based according to science, really thinking and challenging ourselves by asking a key question such as, how can there be a God who exists, and this God, of course, for whom I'm created in their image, continue to permit white supremacy at the hands of white evangelicals who have further oppressed my narrative based off my race? Those are the things that folks are starting to do, right? So that attainment is starting to have a bigger role that's there. So with black educational attainment, you see the rise of the black middle class, more black folks starting to ascertain greater wealth. And again, I'm not saying that a lot of black folks have come to ascertain greater wealth, because again, white supremacy, capitalism, all those things continue to play a major role. But we do see a lot of elevation and success. Myself as a black man who is a middle class person has benefited from past struggles. And so the question that has to be asked among black folks, particularly in the struggle, is, do we believe in God? Do I believe in God? Right? That becomes a question. Can I afford to believe in God if I'm wrestling with that? Such doubt has allowed for the growth in support of a lot of black non-believers who are afraid to come out of the proverbial closet to their black families by telling them that, well, I don't go to church because I no longer believe. Or even for those black folks who grew up in a black church, as they've grown older, they've gotten a little bit of education, as they've moved on in their own professional career, as they've ascertained greater levels of middle class status, they've slowly moved away from the black church. And again, there's not enough time to really overly critique that. I suspect there are other reasons beyond notions of rationalization, rationalism, that's driving that. You know, a group that I follow very, very carefully, and something that I've been saying for a long time that I was going to write about, but I haven't done so, is a group called the Non-Believers Incorporation. And one of the things that they stated, of course, is the fact that we are here to support black people who are non-believers, who do not believe in God, because black people need this type of support, because oftentimes in some families, again, I'm making a generalization here, but in some families, in some parts of the black community, they're ostracized. They are seen as villainous for not believing God. How can you be black and not believe in God? Because, see, it was God. It was that brother, that Palestinian Jewish brother by the name of Jesus, who saved us from the problems of white supremacy. other folks, such as myself, really start to wrestle with that in different ways, in a sense that I continue to see lots of elements of white supremacy still founded within evangelical Christianity, within the white church today, and continues to be oppressive in many ways too. One of the things, of course, that the black non-believers would contend with is the fact that they would say, I quote, I'm not going to quote, but I'm going to paraphrase in some ways. We are here to be a support system for those who've been ostracized from their families and their friends. And we are here to help them continue to grow and find another body and community of black folks who may not be or may not identify as being Muslim or being Christian or having some type of religious orientation. For many black Americans, particularly those who've reached middle-class status, this bourgeois life opened this massive secular window. And I think that's the other part too, right? It's easier to delve in and enjoy the fruits of a secular life that Christians would say is nothing but a sinful life. But yet folks are looking to capitalize on the goods that are taking place in their own venue. It has long been acceptable, for example, for white Americans to be drawn into the material world, not confined by the beliefs of Western religious culture. It's okay for white folks to be atheists. That's just white folks, right? White folks are all kind of stuff, right? White folks worship the notion of being veganist. For example, those are the things that you'll hear, but that's not true when we think about black folks. I think about Mandisia Thomas, who is one of those folks who started the Black Non-Believers Incorporation, and others in her generation. And they've essentially stated that, they've been permitted to step away from the civil rights movement that has essentially inculcated a fabric of early evangelical Christianity that's not a part of the modern black thinkers today. And I say thinkers not in terms of an intellectual sense, but black folks, black thinkers who are starting to wrestle and make sense of what does it mean to be a believer. This idea, of course, is the fact that we've seen so many other movements captivate folks, particularly young black folks today who see justice, the fight for justice in other movements, just not in the biblical Christian movement. That's just one group when we think about that, but still, for many black people, to admit being an agnostic or an atheist is a ticket towards exile, quickly toward exile. That fear of being exiled creates so much anxiety that divorcing the black church, divorcing God is not an option. An atheist within a black community can be seen as criminal. Black folks have long used religion as a way to find answers for their historical suffering within white America, right? We go back to this old, and I would say kind of play it out, added notion of Harriet Tubman, right? The Moses of black folks who followed the North Star, who guided black folks out of bondage, much like Moses did by taking the Jews over the Red Sea into the land known as Israel. Harriet Tubman's going to do that, and she's going to do that under the auspices of Christianity. And though there are black Christians who live a life of moral contradictions with Scripture and with God, they still will contend that there's no place for the non-believer. There's this brother by the name, and I'm going to come back to him a little bit later because I'm going to give you a couple of books that I want to recommend, and some from my own library that I've read that I think it's worth it. Eddie Glaude, he wrote an article titled, "The Black Church is Dead." And in writing this article aims to promote conversations about faith in the church among a generation of blacks who have drifted from traditional religion. He noted that roughly 79% of blacks believe in some semblance of religion, and that it is still greatly important part of their life. Yet the dynamics of the black church, of course, as I've already stated, are changing. This idea of a black church standing at the center of all that takes place in a community has long since passed away. That's something in my parents or my grandparents' past, but that's not really part of the modern way that we define black folks here in the late 20th and even into the 21st century. Instead, different areas of black life have become more distinct and I would say specialized, flourishing outside of the bounds and gaze of black churches. You know, I'm not suggesting that black communities have become wholly secular, because that would be irresponsible. That would be a falsity, because that's just not the case at all. Again, black folks as a people, we are generally very conservative people, and that conservatism is really guided by our sense of biblical Christianity, that belief in Jesus, for example. So just that black religious institutions and beliefs stand alongside a number of other vibrant non-religious institutions and beliefs, that becomes a crux of the conversation. You know, the religious types, the religious academic type sees the church as a vehicle to bring about social justice, right? These are some of the folks that I have lots of conversations with. They see the church as being a formation, as a center, much like in the civil rights era, to eradicating poverty, to addressing issues of societal vice and ills that permeate society in so many ways. And in doing so, this essentially parallels the past of the civil rights movement. Yet there's still a division, right? And we've got to think about that division between the type and those who see pure spiritual devotion in the church. You know, many blacks continue to galvanize behind the Protestant faith of their forebears. Others see it as some form of disillusioned past and seek other venues, other avenues to rally for change that's going to happen in communities. So what does that mean for a lot of folks as we wrestle with this? What does this mean for us moving forward? Why bring this up? How is this relevant in so many ways? I would say it is because I think when we think about black people, when we think about the past, we think about Brother King, we're stuck in a conversation that is, I don't know, almost 70 years old, 60 to 70 years old, and we've not really addressed elements of where black people stand. I am hoping to give a paper at a conference this summer, the Christian Scholars Conference, that's going to be held at a evangelical Christian university named Lipscomb University in Nashville, Tennessee. And part of my paper points out the fact that, particularly within the churches of Christ, but yet there have been books that have addressed this towards all white churches, that the white church cannot be a center for salvation for black folks, right? Black people are going to have to continue to lean on the black church for that. And one of the things that I contend, of course, is the fact that the black church will continue to manifest and be a political center. What's on my mind there? A political center for black people, particularly in terms of struggles. But the white church continues to be a hub for white people. The white church cannot be a anti-racist body. It can't be an anti-racist institution. I mean, if we think back to the 2016 election, over 81% of white evangelical Christians voted for Donald Trump. And black folks would say, because white evangelicals voted for Donald Trump, that is a vote against black people, particularly because you can't be an anti-racist and yet politically support issues that are anti-black. That becomes the pivotal thing. And so you start to see some black folks just step away from religion. You start to see some black folks say that, well, I'm going to have to keep my comfort and my haven only within the black church. Do you have other folks, for example, such as myself, who over a period of time, right? Keep in mind, I attended a religious high school. I attended a college that has a religious affiliation, particularly with the Churches of Christ. And through my observation, the one thing I observed, of course, is the role by which white people practiced the idolatry of their belief when it came to the politics of their sins. It is more important to be a right-wing, fundamental conservative than to support black people. How oftentimes do you see the white evangelical church, for example, denouncing the crimes and the brutality by the Blue Lives people and whatever that is, the Smurfs, if we're going to say that, right? Those become some of the questions that's there. And so back to the topic, back to the conversation that we're delving into about the increasing numbers of black people who are not practicing religion. That number is going to continue to go up. And it's going to go up for obvious reasons: educational attainment, middle class status. But I think one of the things that I don't think I've really hit very hard on so far is for the fact that I think black people are starting to question this God who created human beings in their image. If this God created us in their image, then why is it that we've seen white supremacy continue to play a massive role even here in the 21st century? You know, I hope you'll think about this topic, and it's a fascinating topic. It's one that I write about, I read about a great deal, I think about. You know, as someone such as myself who's a non-believer, I am someone who reads the Bible. I'm someone who thinks about the relationship between believers and non-believers, and what does that mean for the black freedom struggle moving forward. Those are the things that I wrestle with. You know, as I come to a conclusion, I want to recommend some books from my library, some books that I've read that I think you will find interesting. And at the top of that list is a book by a black historian by the name of Anthony Pinn, Pinn. And the title of the book is The End of God Talk, an African-American Humanist Theology. And really, the work is a wonderful piece, as it really addresses the assumptions made, particularly in the theological discourse of the African-American population and the generalizations that are made about us. Another book that I want to point out is Moral Combat: Black Atheists, Gender Politics, and the Value Wars. And this is one, of course, that I think that has a lot of relevancy, particularly with the ongoing cultural wars that we're finding today. Another book that I like to recommend is The Only Prayer I'll Ever Pray: Let My People Go. And I think y'all all know that phrase quite a bit. Lastly, Black and Not Baptist. Oh, fabulous read. And of course, this one really delves into the idea of what does it mean to be black in a community, and yet you're starting to struggle with this notion of black religiosity in your own sense of moving forward and your understanding of spiritual formations. You know, a lot of black folks, right? Such as myself, who have moved away from Christianity, we've done so because we have been impacted by white supremacy in so many ways. We've seen what white evangelicals have done. We've seen the practice of white supremacy and racism aimed at us for a period of time. And the questions that we think about and the things that run through our mind is, I'm not quite sure this is really my belief. I think we've been hoodwinked. I think we've been bamboozled by this. I think there are underlying conditions and issues that are driving this. You also have, of course, some folks, too, who are moving away from religion, particularly Christianity, not so much because of issues of white supremacy, and that's where I'm at. I think you have some folks who are starting to ask questions like, okay, this doesn't make sense. I'm a rational person. You know, I can't wrap my mind around this. And I'm not saying that science and religion can't work together. And I think I've seen a lot of great arguments. And again, that's another whole show, and that would take quite a bit of time. But I think people are starting to really ponder and thinking about that too. So next time you see your neighborhood black person, if there are any in your hood. I think this is an interesting conversation to have, but just don't walk up to a black person and say, oh, you're black. Do you believe in God? Makes you develop some other kind of relationships too and try to break bread. So, folks, I appreciate your time. I'm glad that you were able to join me this evening for another episode of Race Matters. I'm glad you were able to work with me as we thought about this notion of what does it mean to be black and to be a non-believer, to not believe in God? And those are the questions that we frequently think about too. Until next time, folks, cheers. Enjoy your evening. I'm out of here. Take care.